Good morning and a warm welcome to you all.
And a warm welcome to the Finding the Words conference, and apologies for being a couple of minutes late starting. I'm Bethan and I'll be facilitating the event this morning. I'll be speaking mainly in Welsh, therefore before we start, can I please check that you've selected the correct language option when you first joined the call this morning? If not, can you please log off and re-enter the conference? I also want to check that those in the room here have the correct facilities for their translation, so I will now switch to Welsh.
Garmon is the translator this morning, so I hope that you are all now able to hear Garmon's voice coming through in the headsets. There we are. Thanks once again to you all for joining us. The fact that so many of you have come online today shows how important this subject is to you as a profession. This is a highly sensitive subject, and it is a trigger warning in that some of you could be affected by what you hear and what we will be discussing this morning. There's support available to you during the morning, and the details can be seen on screen. You can get in touch confidentially through chat, and from providing your contact details, the therapists can get back in touch with you. Originally, there was a plan for everyone to split into breakout rooms, but since so many of you have registered, we were going to do this as one large session. But there's still an opportunity to participate. You're welcome to submit questions and comments in the chat box. Please don't share any personal information about other people in the chat. Do keep your questions and comments to those that are of a general nature. The session will last up to 2 hours and a half, and there's an opportunity at the end to discuss some of the issues that will be raised by you. There will be a short break, about 5 minutes, halfway through, and the conference is also being recorded. Those are the housekeeping matters, so it's time for us now to start the conference and introduce our first speaker. Lynn Neagle has been a member of the Senedd from the very beginning in 1999. And since Vaughan Gething's appointment as First Minister, she is the Cabinet Secretary for Education. Before that, she was Deputy Minister for Mental Health and Wellbeing. So this area is one she has a keen interest in. This morning, she's going to give us a view of the political landscape and the important role that staff working in education and pastoral leaders play in preventing self-harm and suicide. So welcome to the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Lynn Neagle.
Diolch. Bore da, good morning, and thank you all for taking the time to attend this important event which deals with the highly sensitive and emotive issues of suicide and self-harm prevention. This is my first major event as Cabinet Secretary for Education, and it feels really appropriate that it's on the subject of suicide and self-harm, which is so close to my heart. I'm really encouraged to see the high numbers registered, but I know it indicates the growing concern you and others working across education have around this and other mental health and well-being issues. I also know you've come here today because you care. You care about the children and young people you meet, and that gives me real hope for the future. Today will be challenging and emotional, but above all, we hope it will help you to better feel equipped to support children and young people. It builds on the guidance we published in 2019, which was designed to help adults who work with children and young people to respond to issues of suicide and self-harm. It looked at how to ask questions regarding suicide feelings or self-harming and how to respond to disclosure of these feelings and behaviours. We know that the last few years have been particularly difficult for our young people. The pandemic and the lockdowns, disruptions in schooling have contributed to increased anxiety and isolation. So it is really timely and crucial that we continue to address these issues and support you as you seek to help young people. Making sure our young people have the best chance in life is a real passion for me. A good education in an inclusive, safe and nurturing environment helps build skills, knowledge and resilience. It is the greatest gift we can give our children and young people to enable them to reach their full potential, whatever that might be. However, I know that you cannot do this alone. Schools, teachers and support staff cannot and should not meet all the needs of the children and young people in your care. We will only do that if we work together. I believe we need a collaborative whole system approach which has well-being at its foundation, which empowers and supports the education workforce and includes other public services in health, local authorities and elsewhere in a true multi-agency way. That is the only way we can really address the needs of our young people holistically and at the right time and in the right way. Supporting the mental health and well-being of our children and young people has been my focus for many years, one which I championed as chair of the Children, Young People and Education Committee in the Senedd, and which I continued to champion when I joined the Welsh Government as Deputy Minister for Mental Health and Wellbeing. I will continue to champion this in my new role as Cabinet Secretary for Education. My aim now in education is to implement and embed a holistic and inclusive approach to emotional well-being in schools. I am sure you know about our framework on embedding a whole school approach to emotional and mental well-being, which we published in 2021. That framework sets out the statutory requirements placed on schools and local authorities with the corresponding and complementary NEAth-NEST framework indicating the responsibilities for health and social care sectors. Together, these documents demonstrate how services can ensure joint working practices and detail the need for professionals to share their knowledge and expertise to better support children and young people. Whether that is for low-level mental health issues or for more severe and enduring mental health problems. Building on these two documents, we are currently consulting on our new mental health and wellbeing strategy and our new suicide and prevention strategy for Wales. The consultation is open until the 11th of June, and we would really welcome your feedback and views. These set out our commitment over the next 10 years to develop and work with partners as part of that whole system approach to protect, improve and provide support for mental health and to prevent suicide and self-harm. The strategies are the result of significant engagement. Listening to people with lived experience has been fundamental to their development, and I am so pleased that we were able to do that. We worked with a series of external reference groups and with young people to help shape the strategies. It was a genuine partnership and co-production approach. Our draft strategies have each been developed around two high-level visions. Our mental health and wellbeing strategy aims for people in Wales to live in communities which promote, support and empower them to improve their mental health and wellbeing and be free from stigma and discrimination. We will take a rights-based approach to ensuring that everyone has the best mental health possible. The two strategies are separate but interconnected. This approach recognises that suicide and self-harm are not diagnosable mental health conditions, and many people who die by suicide are not known to mental health services. There is also a prevailing misconception that people who die by suicide have a mental illness, and it is vital that we challenge this perception to remove the stigma and ensure that people who need support are able to access it. It is a key theme emerging from all our engagement, not to medicalise mental health. Mental health has become a term that is used to describe a wide range of circumstances, and we want to see a shift in how we talk about and support mental health issues to better reflect the needs of individuals. We know that the majority of people who might define themselves as having a mental health issue do need support, but they don't need specialised mental health services. For those that do need specialised mental health services, we have been clear about how we intend to strengthen these further. As Cabinet Secretary for Education, I will continue to strive for a connected system of support where people can access the right service at the right time and in the right place. I will concentrate my attention on education, on children and young people, on staff and the whole school community. Our national mission for education places well-being as the foundation on which to build educational reform. And it is central to the new curriculum for Wales and school improvement and development. Our goal in all of this work is to ensure that care and support will be person-centred, compassionate and recovery-focused, with an emphasis on improving quality, safety and access, and that this will be delivered by a workforce that feels supported and has the capacity, skills and confidence to meet children and young people's needs. This may seem daunting and you may feel you are not equipped to do this, but I want you to know that you're not alone and I intend to support you along the way. I will continue to support the commitments we have made. I truly believe in a holistic approach to well-being within education for pupils, their families and for the staff working across the system. I hope that this event and the skills we hope you take away with you today will help you feel more equipped when children and young people approach you as trusted adults, and more equipped to have those early conversations with them. It is a privilege when someone comes to you to disclose their feelings, be it suicide or self-harm or other worries, but we recognise it is also a tremendous responsibility, one that can leave you feeling anxious or daunted. Please know that you're not alone. There are established links to safeguarding leads and pathways of support, of course, but we are also working to strengthen the training and services to support you and ensure that you feel confident in the next steps and confident that our young people will get the help they require. We must ensure a resilient and well-supported workforce. Only then can we help children and young people to achieve their full potential that is not based or judged entirely on academic results. I know that you've joined today because you care about young people, so you want to learn how to support them more effectively. And we care about you and the work you do. I hope that today will help you to have those vital conversations and to be confident when you do. Thank you so much for all that you do, and I look forward to working with you in the future to build the education system that our young people and our educators truly deserve. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr, Cabinet Secretary, for such an insightful speech and for your commitments to champion mental health and emotional well-being in your new role.
We're going to be asking your views as well during the conference in the form of an online vote. That's online, and you'll be receiving a question now, so we're asking you to vote, please. The first question is, before registering for this event, were you aware of the guidance issued in 2019 on responding to issues of self-harm and thoughts of suicide in young people? If you could please vote either yes or no. So that's therefore the introduction by the Cabinet Secretary on the subject and the first vote. We're now switching to the academic side to give us an overview of our current understanding and our attitude to self-harm and suicide in Wales. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Anne John of Swansea University.
Hi. So my name's Anne John. I'm a Professor of Public Health and Psychiatry at Swansea University. I also chair the National Advisory Group on Suicide and Self-Harm Prevention. But as well as that, I'm a parent of 3 children who are going or have been through the school system in Wales. I'm a school governor. I do lots of academic research in this field, and previously I was a GP. And over the years, I've given advice to a number of schools where a child has been lost through suicide in how to respond. Now, in this area, we know there's a problem. So over the last 10 years, the there's been an increase in self-harming behaviours in young people. Now, when I used to get asked by journalists about this 10 years ago, at first I would go, well, self-harm is a very hidden problem. It could just be we're seeing rates increase in hospitals and emergency departments and primary care because people are seeking help more, and then we're actually managing them. But there are really well-designed community surveys that are showing us that self-harm has increased, particularly in older adolescent girls, but also the behaviour is manifesting itself earlier in a young person's life. Now, we know that both for self-harm and suicidal behaviours, there are some evidence-based interventions. We know that for some of the risk factors for self-harm, like bullying, there are some evidence-based. There's one trial that showed a 20% reduction in bullying behaviours. But when we try and implement those evidence-based interventions into systems like schools or the NHS, often what worked in a very well-designed trial is not what we see happening in schools. And part of that is because systems are stressed, teachers are stressed, we've all come out of a pandemic, sometimes there aren't the resources to deliver these interventions. And we know that when people need specialist services, that there's a bit of a treatment gap. So access to specialist services is not what we would all want. And that makes us think about prevention. But we often are much more focused on how we manage problems rather than how we prevent. So I think in a system that's going to work, we need to be balancing both. And that involves families, schools, things like youth workers and contextual safeguarding. It involves both really important work that happens in the early years, but it can be very difficult to have that sort of impact around families, and then adolescence, where young people are much more out in the world and we might be able to have more impact. So schools are complex public health systems. There's a huge policy emphasis, which Lynn Legal has just talked about. And there's a vast number of programmes to choose from. And some of those programmes, the evidence of whether they work or not isn't very good. Some of them, they don't work at all. And some of them do harm. And I guess this is a call from me to really think about evidence-based programs. So if we think about mindfulness, so I can remember my children, I can remember my daughter coming home and I said, what's your new teacher like? And she said, oh, she's a bit weird. She made us trace our fingers and put a Malteser on our tongue. And I thought, that's mindfulness. But there was a big trial last year called the Myriad trial that looked at mindfulness interventions in secondary schools. And what it showed was it made very little difference and in fact could do harm when implemented across all schools to children who had pre-existing problems. So it really illustrated that sometimes things that seem like common sense, you really do need to look at the evidence. So we need evidence-based programs prioritised. And also for everyone working in that whole school approach to have research literacy. So it's understanding what does the evidence mean when it's in front of you. So something like school uniform. I've heard a few times in my career people go, well, school uniform, it's a real basis for behaviour. Actually, the evidence is really mixed, which means we don't know what the answer is at all. And if you look around the world, I don't think we can say that our children are better behaved than children in Germany or the States. So that research literacy, having that critical eye around the things that we're doing is really important. And I think the whole school approach, when you've got a system, you need a whole school approach to make things happen. So it's really important. Now, you'll hear, when people talk about evidence, you'll hear people bandying around about universal, targeted and indicated. What that basically means is you're going to do something that's aimed at all children, or you're going to do it at children who are at high risk, or at children who are self-harming. Now, universal interventions tend to be much more focused on prevention and skills training. What's great about universal interventions in schools is they're not stigmatizing. You're not taking certain children and putting them into certain programs. And that's where those sort of selected and indicated programs the uptake can be poor. Because for many of the children who are already feeling a bit isolated and excluded, they don't want to be further pinpointed. So that's where universal interventions are really great. The problem with universal interventions is that if I'm doing something that works to a child that's very high risk, it's what in my world we call a big effect size. I can make a big difference. And that big difference is really easy for me to measure in research. When you're doing something that might make a little difference to a lot of children, so actually the impact of it could be huge, it's quite difficult to do research on that. Because to measure that little change, I need to do my study in lots and lots of children. So it's harder to get good evidence for universal interventions. And that's why it can be really tricky. So one of the things we did recently, commissioned by the NHS exec, was look at interventions to prevent self-harm in schools. Now, you know, many of you will have heard of the Three Dads Walking. There's been a lot of talk about teaching self-harm, about self-harm directly in schools. What we did was look at those studies. Now, many of the studies based in schools won't actually measure impact on self-harming behaviours. What they'll do is has your awareness improved? Has your knowledge improved? Without actually looking at, does that knowledge improvement change outcomes for children? So what we did find that there were a number of universal, selective and indicated interventions that worked. The best is Youth Awareness of Mental Health Programme. Now it's role play for children, it's pupil-led discussions. There's been a big trial in Europe that showed it reduced self-harming behaviours in schools. There's another big trial by about, so suicide attempts reduced by about 50%. There's also another trial in the States, and there's a trial that's going to report based in a number of schools in the UK. So you know, the evidence base for YAM is really, really building. It doesn't, whereas people talk about we need to teach, we need to address stigma and teach directly about suicide and self-harm. In fact, many of the interventions that reduce suicide and self-harm are much more about teaching what we call cognitive flexibility, being able to adapt, resilience, responding well to distress, positive scoping skills and relationship skills. But we always need to remember when you're doing those things, even when you're delivering YAM, some children may talk about self-harm. And when that comes up, it's really important to address it and not feed into stigma. Because what stigma does, and you know, and we all experience it, there are, you know, we feel uncomfortable. That might be due to personal experience. That might be due to the fact that we're worrying that if we talk about something, it's going to make it happen more with the child. There's no evidence that that happens. But there is evidence that if we feed into stigma, it stops people seeking help. And that's one of the biggest issues in this area, is it's a hidden behaviour. But staff need to be supported in delivering these interventions. We need to have more research into their safety and how well they work. So there's lots of There's lots of work to do, but the evidence is really building about things that we can do in schools. And I'm not sure how clearly you can see that online, but basically I'm sure if we had like all morning and I asked you all to list what are the risk factors to do with self-harm and suicidal behaviours in young children, you could all do it. You know, we know what they are. We know that they're, you know, about childhood adversity, experiencing bereavement through suicide. But the main thing is to understand there's no single cause. It's usually a complex interaction of many risk factors across a child's life. And that because there are two things that means. So one, many of these things are preventable. Suicide death is preventable, it's not inevitable. And two, there's no single organisation. This isn't just on schools, this isn't just on health, this isn't just on parents or friends. It's everyone working together to prevent suicide and creating systems where we can intervene. But because of that, you know, when I was working clinically, I used to think strategies were just boring things that boring people sat around in rooms talking about, and it didn't make any difference. The stuff I was doing was the real stuff. But actually, you need strategies and policies so that efforts are coordinated. Because if efforts are coordinated, you're much more likely to make change. Really important to understand risk start building at a young age. So childhood adversity, ACEs, whatever you want to call it, traumatic, stressful things that happen to us and around us at children have a big impact on our health and well-being later on. There's millions of studies about this. Now, those things can be of anything that impact on our feelings of safety, on our feelings of stability, and on validation. Increasingly, you know, validating people's experiences, not dismissing it, not being judgmental, these things have a huge impact. And adversity in childhood also encompasses, so we think about all the usual things, you know, abuse, neglect, but it's also things like poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity, the disruption that happened during COVID to children's education. These are all childhood adversities. And there are numerous studies that show that there is a strong link between self-harm and suicide. Now, in those studies, there's a thing about causality in my world. And one of the things that makes you think that the relationships are much stronger is if you have a dose response. What we call a dose response is very medicalized terminology. What it essentially means is if you've got more of something, so if you smoke more cigarettes, you're more likely to get lung cancer. And we see that in the relationship between childhood adversity and suicide and self-harm. The more different types of childhood adversity that a child is exposed to, the stronger the relationship with these behaviours. So it's really important to see these behaviours in the context of a person's life and address them as such. Now, every 6 years or so, we review deaths by suicide in children in Wales. And we look at coroner's reports, we look at health reports to identify themes. Now, self-harm is one of the most, these are called thematic reviews. There are 2 reports currently. Self-harm is the most strongest risk factor for suicide. But it's important to remember that self-harm is relatively common in young people. So in a class of 30 14-year-olds, there will be at least 3 children who are self-harming. You know this. Thankfully, every suicide is much rarer. However, suicide in this age group is devastating. So these are the sorts of themes that we identified, you know, so self-harm, care experienced children, LGBTQ+, substance use, bullying, I'll come back to bullying a bit later, rape and sexual assault, interpersonal difficulties, academic pressures and stress, online and bereavement through suicide. So, you know who these children are. Bereavement is a really important risk factor. It comes up in almost everything that, all the research that I do. I know Claire Cotter, who's going to speak after me, is going to talk a bit about that. We don't have a clear idea of how many children are bereaved through suicide. There's a piece of work that we're doing at the moment. Bereavement through suicide is different. It's much more complicated. The things that are happening in that child's family are much more complicated. There are long-term relationships with suicidal behaviours and depression. Really important in schools to have policy and training in how to have these conversations with young people. Sometimes it takes time for children to make sense, and the sense of it changes as they age. So it's really important to manage their return to school, develop close relationships with the family, have an understanding between the school and home about what's been shared with the child. And going back again to that, it doesn't hurt to ask. Is that straightforward language and questions are fine. Doesn't put ideas into anyone's head. And listen. The main thing is to not increase stigma. The level of shame that can be involved in this area, both, if the behaviours are there, or if a parent has died by suicide, is not something that's easy to communicate. So sort of managing our own emotions in those situations and being able to have very straightforward conversations are really important. And signpost to specialist bereavement services, but the timing that people are open to that can be very different for children. So thinking back to those risk factors, suicide-related internet use, a fifth of deaths by suicide in children and young people are associated with problematic internet use. And by that, I mean searching for information on methods, posting messages, or being bullied online. It's really important to ask children about these things. But remember, so often when I'm speaking in these sorts of, scenarios, people my sort of age will be like, oh my God, the online environment is terrible. One, it's not terrible. It has harms and benefits. For children who are lonely and isolated, they can find communities of people with, questioning their gender identity online, as opposed to feeling really isolated. However, there are harms. There's normalization of behaviours. There's sharing and encouraging online. Remember, it's not a dichotomy, and that harms and benefits can happen for the same person at different times and for different people differently. So something that someone finds harmful, another person might find beneficial. The online environment isn't going away. It's increasingly being used by young people to express their distress. I do lots of work with industry, so with Facebook, TikTok platforms, and work with Samaritans. But in schools, it's about thinking about how do you respond to distressed posts? We need children to understand their digital citizenship online. It's an area, it's a setting that isn't going away. And in most settings that children are in, there are many adults. This is one of those settings where it's predominantly they're interacting with their peers. So we need to work with them. Clustering. So suicide is the leading cause of death of 10 to 19-year-olds. It's important to remember that suicide rates are much higher in middle-aged men. But the thing about young people is, one, it's so devastating, but two, because they're not dying from other things. So that's one of the reasons why it's one of the most leading causes. However, the effect is profound, both for families and school communities. Fear, anxiety, blame, prolonged grief, trauma, clustering in young people is 2 to 4 times more common, so that's sort of imitative behaviour, than in adults over 25 years. We think of a cluster as a greater number of deaths than expected. That could be in a setting, that could be over time, that could be in a certain geography. It's much commoner in institutions like schools, universities, and psychiatric units. Responding appropriately when there are deaths that are linked is suicide prevention. But it's a really, really difficult time. And I guess it's worth understanding that in Wales now, there are regional coordinators that can help you in that response. The evidence of how to respond is, it's not extensive, but there is best practice guidance available and more being developed. Being prepared is really important. Having named people is really important. Thinking about bereavement support, Samaritans have a step-by-step program. Providing support. We often think about providing support for the people directly around the young person that's died, but actually there'll be wider people in the school who identify with that person because they were bullied or because they were captain of the school team, who may have vulnerabilities like mental health and self-harm problems. We need to provide support for them. Have a single point of contact with the media. Think about memorials. Memorials can romanticize deaths. However, they can also be a place, so the way we talk about it is this needs talking about and thinking about. Communication with parents and everything is really important, and think about support services. So what's self-harm? It's intentional self-injury. I'm almost giving you like a runaround of this whole area. Intentional self-injury or self-poisoning, irrespective of motivation. Some people self-harm to manage their emotions. Some people self-harm to express their distress. Those motivations can be different. Some people self-harm and they feel ambivalent about whether they want to live or die. Some people want to die. Some people are just managing their emotions. So intent and motivation change. But whatever those intents and motivations are, the risks remain. It can be cutting, burning, hair pulling, interfering with wound healing, or overdosing. It's an important signal of distress that it's an opportunity for intervention. It's one of those things that people feel very uncomfortable about. In health, where we have these guidelines by an organisation called NICE, it's the only guideline that says treat people with respect and dignity. And that's because stigma and sometimes personal experience means that we're like, stop doing that, stop attention seeking. I'm really thinking about those attitudes, and being non-judgmental is important. Over half of young people who die by suicide have a history of self-harm, but self-harm is relatively common in school-aged children. So what we found was that those who self-harm were achieving as well as everyone else in primary school. But when they got to secondary school, it dropped considerably. Whereas with something like depression, children were consistently not achieving through primary and secondary school. So this is really something where if we intervene early enough, it's great. Suicide is the tip of the iceberg. About 1 in 10 children aged 14 will be self-harming, and about 1 in 9 of those will seek help from clinical services. So as Lynn Neagle has just said, most children who self-harm are in the community. We did a study where we linked the school health Research Network survey happens every 2 years in schools. And we asked about whether, kids were bullied. About 35% of them said they were, whether it was face-to-face or online or both. We then linked them to their health data to see who had self-harmed. We saw significant increases in self-harm, particularly with face-to-face bullying. But we think we didn't have the numbers for cyberbullying. But the really interesting thing is loneliness, isolation, and not belonging are all associated with self-harm behaviours. And we found that children who answered that they were lonely in the summer were much more likely to self-harm if they were bullied. And what that says to me, that's something we can do something about. That's modifiable. Cyberbullying. Victims of cyberbullying are twice as likely to self-harm as those who aren't, but perpetrators are also more vulnerable to self-harming behaviours. And with cyberbullying, it's very rare for a child to be one or the other. There's lots more crossover in those, victim-perpetrator language behaviours than there was in face-to-face bullying. So cyberbullying needs to be incorporated into anti-bullying programs in schools. It needs to be asked about. Clinicians and teachers should always be asking about it. And it shows you, that perpetrators are equally as vulnerable, how important restorative practice is. I think it's seeing two children, not as victims and perpetrators, but what we talk about is bullying involvement and working with both of them. Another study we did, and this was between 2012 and 2016, we looked at 400,000 children in Wales in their education data, and we linked them to their health data. So what we did was we basically looked at children who were absent or excluded from school. We looked at a range of mental health problems and self-harm. What was there? Unsurprisingly, so sometimes I say to my team, the work we do is not rocket science. If I go and ask any teacher, most of them will be able to tell you this. Unsurprisingly, kids who were absent or excluded were much more likely to have mental health problems or be self-harming. Now, with absence, and we used the old 20% definition of persistent absence here, rates were consistently higher. So the black line, the lower line, are absence rates in children who don't self-harm. The upper line is those who do. So rates of self-harm increased with age in children who were persistently absent. Pupils with a record of self-harm were twice as absent in the most deprived compared to the least deprived. So this is an inequality issue as well. And those who had SEN status, I know it's ALN now, had a reduced likelihood of self-harming. So interventions matter. In exclusions, it was even more stark. Children who were excluded from school were 7 times more likely to self-harm. And that was much higher when they were from more deprived communities and much higher in boys. So children who self-harm spend less time in school. The relationship is bidirectional. So it's being excluded affects belonging, increases isolation, but also mental health problems make you more likely to be excluded. You routinely collect that data in schools, and it could be used to target assessment and early intervention in these children. We do have InReach, we do have, counselling services in schools. It really is important to do that whole school approach and really identify these children who are absent and excluded from school. Now, we've changed the definition in Wales for persistent absence to 10%. Why that's important is it highlights children much earlier, but also In Wales and also England, we have an issue around attendance post-pandemic. And we need to understand the risks that come with that. So we need to improve responses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that we've just done, where we've looked at over 500,000 children in Wales between 2012 and 2019, aged 10 to 16, looking at those who were excluded, either permanently or a fixed time exclusion. We found about 25,000 children in that time. I was quite shocked by that, but it's about 4.3%. We looked at persistent absence as well, and then we linked it to ONS data. So we looked, of those children, how many had died by suicide? And we found 100 up to the age of 24. And we found 123 children who'd been excluded from school had died by suicide in that time period. And we adjusted for if they had a mental health problem, if they had SEN status, for levels of deprivation. This isn't published yet. We're about to submit it. Excluded pupils were 2.3 times more likely to die by suicide than those who weren't excluded, even after we adjusted for risk factors. So it's really important. It wasn't significant with persistent absence. So it's really important to recognise those links with childhood adversity and intervene. School may be one of the last opportunities we get to work with these children, because then they become NEETs, which was highlighted. So the guidance we developed, I think in 2019, is, we've mentioned it a couple of times already. I know that both Claire Cotter's team and in the education department, we're looking at how we can improve this. But the things that we highlighted were about, if a child approaches you, about their self-harming behaviours, they usually will have been self-harming in private for a long time. It's taken a lot of guts for them to approach you. And the main thing is to respond in a listening, non-judgmental way. Don't respond by saying, stop that, or ignoring them. I can remember a young person saying to me, she'd lost her mother had died, and she went from being a very active, successful student to self-harming, and she was wearing, she described to me being in school, she'd suddenly gone into big baggy jumpers and things. And she said, I had some bandages poking out of my sleeve, and I saw my teacher look at them, but she didn't ask me about them. Really important to ask in a non-judgmental way. Don't say things like, stop that, why are you doing that, well, you're so beautiful, stop. These are really common responses. There should be a named person in every school. Always explain the limits of your confidentiality. Now, one of the things that students, pupils in health and education hate is they've confided in someone, and that person has responsibilities often to tell others. But that's not always communicated to the young person. So the next thing they know is someone that they've never spoken to is asking them about how they are, with the best intentions in the world. So it's really important to have that conversation about who are you going to talk to. So I think, hopefully we're going to develop this guidance in consultation with all of you, and also in a format that's more accessible, so an app or online. But those are the sorts of principles. Take someone somewhere private. Know that it's probably not going to be a one-off conversation. One of the biggest things that makes a difference to young people is having a trusted adult. Also, be very clear about the limits of your own skills. It's okay to hand on. It's better to hand on. It's better to follow the pathways. So this is my last slide. And I guess it's really to say the stresses, those adversities that I've talked about before suicide are really common in young people. And it's really important to remember that most come through them without serious harm. But we need to manage them all to prevent the few. So it's thinking about those family factors, parental mental illness, abuse and neglect, bullying, physical health, social isolation. Think about very specific actions for children who are bereaved. This priority for mental health and suicide prevention in schools is absolutely to be welcomed. Housing and mental health care for looked after children. Mental health support for LGBTQ+ young people. On a broader level, it's removing things about methods from the internet. This is really important. In schools, encourage online safety. How to respond to distress posts. Think about those social, emotional life skills. When you're doing that sort of work, that is suicide prevention as far as I'm concerned. And then safe dating and relationship skills. If you think about some of those traumatic experiences that happen for young people, and also the risk factors there for substance misuse, alcohol and drugs. So, I guess the one thing is no one is expecting teachers to become mental health professionals. Everyone has their part to play. The role of schools is shared with multiple other agencies, but we need to improve integration and collaboration across all those different services. And I think that response across different services and settings to young people who self-harm is how we make a big difference. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Lovely. Diolch, Anne, for your professional insight there and for raising really informative points and research. I hope you all found that really useful.
There's an opportunity now for another vote. A question will appear for you now. The second question in the vote this morning is, if you were aware of the guidance issued in 2019, have you found them helpful? If you could click either yes or no on that vote. Thank you very much.
Well,
it's good to understand the political and academic background, but hearing about lived experience really does enrich our understanding. We are therefore very grateful to Emily for sharing her experience, and that will be in video form.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm from Port, and during my time in school, I was supported through my experiences of suicidal thoughts and self-harm. So when I was in school, I was always classed as being quite academically able, though I did struggle with the social side of things a bit because I'm autistic, but I also struggled with my mental health quite a bit, but I wasn't really open about that to anyone at the time. So I found it quite hard, quite isolated, because no one really knew what was going on except myself at the surface, below the surface. So it's quite difficult just participating in the usual schools, day-to-day stuff, even just attending lessons. And I was always one of the last ones to turn up at some points, take the longest walk around the school, just have some time to myself and hopefully make it eventually. It was also quite difficult at first to approach someone about what I was experiencing myself. Though once I did it, it was kind of a sense of relief that I told someone, and then they could help me communicate to the others who needed to know. They told me what steps would happen, my parents, at what points they'd been involved and when they'd contact them. And then, of course, my medical team with CAMHS and anyone else who was involved. It was not the easiest, but looking back, it was something I'm glad I quite did, because then I was able to work with people to get the support I needed to like attend school to the more of just turning up and being there. So the person I talked to was my Welsh back teacher at the time. I knew her quite well because I was in school with her son. She felt something like a trust because I enjoyed her lessons. She was very open about stuff. So I spoke to her first. But yeah, and I told a couple of other teachers like eventually. I got involved with Platform probably like a month or two after that initial conversation. It was through my social worker at the time. It was just an email and I was like, maybe, maybe not. And made my mum pick up the phone. And then it kind of went from there. The main thing was when I talked, they listened. And like there was like no kind of judgment involved with that conversation. It's just mainly just an active listener. And then once I talked, they talked to me. It was like, oh, okay, you told me this. This is what we'll do to help support you. And it was always like, if I said no, they were like, okay, we suggest this, but if you don't want to, maybe we'll see how you do without it. But it was always like, I was at the lead that some involvement in the decisions being made, even though at times some of them I couldn't be involved in, but they always told me what was going on and how that would affect me, just keep me in the loop. So when I was in school, I had a lot of support, I think. They received communication from my CAMS team quite a bit about what support they suggested I could have, and that was quite good. So I mainly had like someone I could speak to when I needed to. So I was given that member teacher's timetable so I could know where to find them if I needed to speak to them, have a quick conversation, and then they'd be able to direct me to the right place I needed to go. I actually developed quite a good relationship with the wellbeing team in my school towards the end. I hadn't had much contact with them before. They kind of just lived down one of the ends of the school. I knew where they are, but never really went down there. Yeah, they were really supportive. I could pop down there when I needed to be, and they all knew me quite well in the end. One thing my school did, they helped me create a one-page profile, which was about my interests and then what I personally thought my strengths and weaknesses were. So if I was having a bad day, maybe they had some conversation starters, just for some light-hearted conversations. So like one of mine at the time was about like surfing. I really liked being near the beach, and I was learning to surf at the time. So they chatted to me about that, just light-hearted if I didn't want to chat too deep about anything, which was quite nice. And then my school helped me communicate that with my CAMS team and Platform. And then when I moved to college, they sent that one-page profile over to college, my permission, which was really helpful. So at GCSEs in the end, I got 13 A stars, and then I got all A stars on my A levels. Have now moved on to study physics of astrophysics at Bath. Yeah, I've got a scholarship through the university for kids from underrepresented backgrounds at uni. And one of my main hobbies now is surfing. I first got into it through a Platform activity, just to be involved with other kids with similar experiences. And that's kind of become a hobby of mine. I joined my uni's surf club, and I've recently been out to Morocco on a trip without my parents, which is quite fun. It's just knowing you have someone to speak to outside the home environment can be quite difficult to talk to your parents at times, because obviously you live with them, there's no hiding from them at times. So having someone you can speak to out of that environment is really important, I think, and like vital. Even though it can be quite difficult, it's important to have that connection with someone, I think, outside of the home environment, because not everyone will have a supportive one. It's not be afraid of the teachers. They're not some like older people. They're not your parents. They're humans as well. They are quite understanding hopefully. I know most of mine were. Yeah, and they can help you get the support you need from them within the school setting, because you might not exactly know what's available to you.
Thanks to Emily for sharing her story there. And if that content has affected you, do remember the support available to you this morning. It's now time to have a 5-minute break, so we will reconvene the conference at 11:15. Welcome back to the second half of the conference. Before I introduce our next speaker, a quick reminder about the support available to you today. If the content of this conference has affected you in any way, and there has been information on screen for you to contact us through chat confidentially. And do remember to send over your questions. We will have a question and answer session later on in the conference. We're now ready to hear from one of the main charities in this area. Neil Ingham is Executive Director for Wales Samaritans, and he will now give us an introductory talk on mental health resources available to help staff and pupils develop coping methods and reduce stigma, including practical advice on developing listening skills for sensitive and supportive conversations. Welcome, Neil Ingham.
Hi, I'm Neil Ingham from Samaritans Cymru. I'm conscious today that my role is a straight back one. I've got to share some skills and resources for you. I know they're going to be really practical. We know that professionals find them really helpful, but I've got to set a little bit of context. Professor Anne John's done a huge amount of that already, and my natural space in terms of talking about the broader issues isn't going to be there today. But a bit of context I wanted to share was about two key themes really that run through all the resources that we've produced and I can share with you today. And that really should be the focus of your energies and your thinking around the way that you can best support the people you work with, the young people you work with, in an effort to support them around suicide prevention and self-harm prevention. I'll set that context by starting with Samaritans. Most people know Samaritans have got a listening service. We're there 24/7. You can call us. Not all of the calls we get are about suicidality. About 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of them are. And we're there for people when they're in crisis. At the heart of that listening service is the deep concept of listening, active listening, and also the concept of compassion, so really being attuned and showing an interest in somebody's emotional well-being. Those sound like really simple concepts, and those are things that most of us would think about as being listeners to some degree in our daily lives. And I'm really conscious that as education professionals, yours is an environment where listening is really at the core. I was thinking about this last night and thinking about how many times as a child I was told to listen and all of the discipline around listening and how vital that is for you to be able to do your role. A lot of the environments we might speak to as Samaritans or work in, for example, the rail industry, construction industry, we run prison listener schemes in prisons all across the UK, are not environments where concepts around listening and compassion are maybe as to the fore as they are in the educational area. So I suppose my sense is that when working with professionals such as yourselves, there's a sense that you might feel you know this stuff. That if I asked you all as teachers and education professionals, do you think you're good listeners? Probably more than any other sector I could think of, many of you would put your hands up. And when I ask rooms and conferences of professionals from all sorts of backgrounds, do you think you're good listeners? People will put their hands up. But then when we explain what being a good listener really is and what it means to be a good listener and an active listener and the types of things a Samaritan trains to do to become a fully trained Samaritan listener, those hands start coming down a bit. And people start realizing with, healthy sense of dignity that maybe they're not as good listeners as they could be. Because being a good listener is not just about the intention to listen, there's a whole structure to that. So the resources that we've shared today are full of practical tips, advice, lesson guides, but at the core of them is the intention and a desire to become a compassionate, active listener and to apply that in the work that you're doing. And I know that more than any other sector, you have got the capacity to do that. Briefly, in terms of education, Anne John set the context. Samaritans believe education is a key place in terms of suicide prevention. Early intervention is absolutely key. And we regard suicide as a major public health issue, but also an inequality issue. And Anne spoke really eloquently as ever as to the various risk factors connected to that. So I'm going to share. I've got two things to click here. I've got my slides and I've got my notes. So I'm going to share the resources that Samaritans have got to offer you. All of these resources are free. You can go and download all of them. I think there's some means of sharing these by the conference organisers today with you afterwards as well. They're all available bilingually. I'll share links on the slides, but you can Google any of these resources and within a click or two you'll find them. So the resources I'll share today are DEAL, which is Developing Emotional Awareness and Listening, which is really centred around lesson plans. Step by Step, which is post-vention support. Anne mentioned this earlier. This is really about post-vention in the context of a suicide or suspected suicide incident in the school context. Compassion in Education, which squarely addresses and seeks to build up your capacity to create that compassionate environment in the education context. And then just some reflections on exclusion from education, but maybe not so much as I'd planned, because again, Anne got there first. Okay. Oh, I'm clicking the wrong clicker. So first, compassion. I'll let you just soak up the quotes that are on the slide there. So Compassion in Education is our free toolkit for anyone working in education in Wales. Oh, why is it skipping to that? Sorry. Everything's skipping around in the wrong order. Okay, I'm going to go to DEAL first. So Developing Emotional Awareness and Listening. So this is at the heart of our offer to schools. Again, you can download all of this. The aims of DEAL are to raise awareness of emotional health and the importance of recognising when you need help, to develop positive coping strategies, to reduce stigma and break down barriers around talking about emotional health, to develop communication skills and develop supportive and help-seeking behaviour in young people. So interventions through lessons, we know, can increase empathy and understanding as to how emotional difficulties develop and why some people think that life is not worth living. And even exploring that concept is, of course, a really difficult, heavy place to get to. So the DEAL resources, a really practical guide. You can download all of these, and they centre around lesson plans, which are themed around emotional health, coping strategies, dealing with feelings, and connecting with others. There's also notes for teachers and staff training sessions. Step by Step, our next offer, is our post-vention support service. I'll set a bit of context for this. Anne talked about clusters earlier. You'll all be aware of the situation in Bridgend a number of years ago, which I don't think was ever necessarily defined as a cluster, but where we saw a number of deaths by suicide over a relatively short period of time of a number of young people. Samaritan's local branch there and the wider charity developed Step by Step in the aftermath of those incidents, because it was recognised there was such a need in local schools and schools across the country to provide a better bereavement support, post-vention support offer. So, all my notes out of sync. So Step by Step aims to provide information and support to help the school community and the community as a whole. So that is inclusive of the teachers, the young people, all the connected organisations the school works with, and families as well, come to terms with what has happened, prevent stigma and isolation in the school community, to support school communities to reduce the risk of further suicide. Anne mentioned earlier the risk factor around where you've had an existing suicide, the risk of a follow-on suicide for those connected to that. And obviously within a school community, you get the same types of risks as you might have where you've had, for example, a sibling suicide or a suicide within a friend network. Step by Step aims to reach out to high-risk people and communities to reduce the risk of further suicide. Service is run by a team of trained volunteers called post-vention advisors who can offer practical support, guidance and information on addressing the impact of a suspected or attempted suicide on the school community. Every situation is different, so post-vention advisors can tailor support offered depending on the needs of the school group. So post-vention is the term given to activities that assist those who've been bereaved by suicide to cope with what has happened. Suicide prevention and post-vention are closely linked, as post-vention can also prevent further deaths. So I mentioned earlier that Samaritans works in other settings, so Step by Step is an offer for education. We offer a really similar service in our rail programme, so Samaritans works across the rail industry, and in a slightly different way, we offer the same type of service into that environment because of the knock-on effect of an attempted or a completed suicide on people who work in the rail industry and people who witness such events. So whilst these resources are specific to education, they sit alongside the wider body of work that Samaritans does, and we're always informing and updating the resources and the offer of support and the way that our volunteers support by kind of cross-pollinating the learnings we get from those different interactions in different sectors. Just to give you a flavour of the range of resources on the website around Step by Step, you've got the response to suspected suicide, response to attempted suicide, creating response plans, handling the media, breaking the news. It's really important to say every school, every educational environment is going to have their own policies, their own procedures. You've got the local authority, or LEA, sat in the background with their policies and procedures. So our advice would be, if you're looking at these resources, you can always reach out, and I'll share contact numbers at the end. But these are to be worked with as that whole educational team in that local context, and not necessarily in isolation. And to use these resources to inform and sharpen those plans and procedures preemptively. So compassion in education. This is our main resource, and Work on Education in Wales focuses on compassion. So we launched this in 2019, and it's now used across England too. We've got a bit of a track record as Samaritans of creating stuff in Wales that then ends up across the UK, not least these resources I'm sharing with you today. And that's partly because of the way we've been able to work with Welsh Government in recent years. So for example, we've worked with Lynn and in her previous role as Minister for Mental Health, to get the duty for mental health and well-being attached to the new curriculum. And then we're now working with Welsh Government officials to bring that commitment to well-being and mental health through in that curriculum, and to bring this notion of compassion to life really in those curriculum plans. So you could see compassion in education really as a precursor to that work coming through into the new Welsh curriculum. So compassion really crucially, I think we all have a sense of what that means. I guess the lazy form of that would be to think, well, compassion's about being nice and caring, but it needs to be more active than that, just as listening needs to be more active than kind of having your ears open. Compassion is the ability to understand the emotional state of another person or oneself. It's based on empathy, respect, and dignity. So whilst empathy is the ability to put yourself in the other person's place and understand their distress, compassion has the additional element of actively wanting to help them. It's the ability to understand and sympathise with the emotional state of another person whilst having the motivation to help and prevent their distress. So the compassion shown to pupils, students and staff can improve how they perceive their interactional relationship and can make them feel valued and cared for. And Anne talked earlier about how important that is in the context of people maybe lonely or isolated, but that sense of being valued and validated being so key to young people today. So compassion is a really powerful response and an approach to addressing that need or meeting that need. So compassion in education provides you with resources that can support you to teach or talk about mental health, some self-harm or suicides. There's lots of key facts which address many of the risk factors that Anne's talked about this morning. Practical conversation and listening tips. I'm not going to share with you all our listening tips today. If you search for Samaritans listening tips, you'll get a kind of 5-minute ready reckoner on some practical listening tips. They're called our shush tips that will help you practice being a better listener. And my top tip for the day would be that you can practice those at home. Maybe before you practice them at work, and you'll probably pretty quickly realise there's scope for improvement. I certainly have. The resource offers you support on what to do in a crisis, on understanding emotional distress, spotting the signs of emotional distress, provides resources to help you look after yourself, because addressing these issues is difficult and places a burden on you. And as Anne said earlier, we all need to know our limitations, both in terms of skills, but also our emotional capacity to support others. And certainly within Samaritans, our listeners on the phones and in the other contexts we work, we've got lots in place to protect our listeners and to make sure they can check out at points where they need to and support each other. You need to do the same in the context in which you work. And then there's plenty of signposting. So the types of questions that you may have in your mind coming away from a day like today, or a conference like this, or as you think about these issues, are practical questions, such as, what happens if somebody brings up suicide in a lesson and says that they know someone who took their own life? Or what if someone shares that they're feeling suicidal or self-harming? It's So the resource, and I'm not going to go through a response to those questions today, resource squarely answers those types of questions and tries to arm you with some practical tips and structures for responding to those types of scenarios. Again, mindful that your school will have its own procedures. Again, mindful that each child will have its own context. And the school or yourself will be aware of that context to a varying degree and will have the safeguarding procedures and the various structures around that individual child. But we do try to arm you with practical responses to those very difficult questions because these are incredibly difficult issues to address. Probably easier to address one-on-one in some senses than they might be in a whole classroom environment. So finally, I just wanted to reflect on our work on exclusion, which again Anne touched on today. So we've done a lot of work recently on exclusion. Exclusion in school is linked to recurring inequalities, circumstances and consequences, so loneliness and isolation, poverty, criminal justice system or links to that, ALN or SEN, that language is always changing, poor parental mental health and suicide risk itself. So research-wise, in 2018, Samaritans Cymru published a report on the link between socioeconomic disadvantage and suicidal behaviour and how we can find a way forward in Wales. And we know that part of the answer lies in raising awareness amongst the many agencies who work with those experiencing socio-economic disadvantage and emotional distress. So our report set out 10 recommendations, and I'll share with you the report in a moment, which we'd urge you to look at and think about the ways in which you at a local or in a school-based setting can start to implement or think through how you can move closer to the implementation of those recommendations. So one of those key recommendations was concerned with addressing the cost of exclusion from school. We recognise that exclusion from school is a significant issue which is linked to factors that increase the risk of suicide. We wanted to explore this issue further. So in 2019, we held a seminar attended by representatives from schools, local government, health service, third sector organisations, universities, Welsh commissioners, because as Anne said earlier, all of these solutions need to be collective. So the first step in terms of addressing exclusion-related risk is to recognise the importance of it and to recognise the importance of it to the individuals involved, and particularly the links to isolation. And as Anne said earlier, there are practical mitigations to isolation, whether that's in relation to summer holidays or exclusion from school. So as many of you, I don't know what's happened to my notes. I'm really sorry for this. I've got notes all over the place. So in 2014, a thematic review of deaths of children and young people through probable suicide of Wales found that many of them had not been in education, employment or training, and when they died as such, had received little or no support from services. It also identified many had SEN or ALN and restricted educational achievement. Large study on UK study on exclusion from school found exclusion was more common among children of lower socioeconomic status. So there you see that cyclical risk between poverty, disadvantage, and issues like isolation in school, and that wider ACEs agenda. So I'd link you to that report, which contains our recommendations. I'm sorry I've muddled that section because my notes are just all out of sync for some reason. The report contains recommendations for school leaders, public services, and policy makers. We'd urge you to engage with those. I think I've probably done my 20 minutes now. I haven't got time for the shush listening tips. If you've got any questions, you can get in touch with myself or Emma Gooding, my colleague. Go to Samaritans' website, search for these resources. There's a wealth of stuff on there. And there's also the broader Samaritans offer in terms of listening tips and broader advice on how you can be a more compassionate, an actively compassionate and an actively listening individual in all aspects of your life. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neil, for that information and the practical advice that hopefully will be of assistance to you if a situation should arise, and also the materials available by the Samaritans. We're now going to turn to examples of real-life conversations and how to respond. We're just waiting for them to come onto the stage. And to lead us through this, can I please introduce Joanna Holmes of the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy.
My name is Jo Holmes. I work for the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, as I've been introduced as, and I'm the Children, Young People and Families lead there. I'm also the safeguarding lead, and had the pleasure for 10 years of being a designated safeguarding lead in a very busy school in England. Other bits and pieces I've been working with over the years includes, Anne mentioned the NICE guidelines around self-harming and suicide, so working as part of that consultation process and very much having respect and good listening and a non-judgmental approach as parts of those guidelines. So, I've been asked to speak today about having difficult conversations. As counsellors and psychotherapists, we have these conversations, you know, quite often, but we learn to have some sort of, perhaps some active listening skills that many of us can adapt and use as a reference point. So, a great start is having these conversations about self-harm and suicide, and having that as part of your ongoing CPD. I would suggest, and it's been mentioned already, to try do some role play at home. We're going to do some role play today. If you were all with us in an audience, I'd have you in pairs and you'd be doing role play as we're going along. But luckily, you've got away with that. But I've got my wonderful assistant here, Alice, who's going to help with some of that. So yeah, do practice in teams and with colleagues as well. It's already been mentioned, and I will mention it again. Be aware of the parameters of confidentiality. Always check a pupil's understanding of that and follow safeguarding procedures. So let's put those aside for now, because what we're going to talk about is if you are that first trusted person, if you like, that somebody, a child, a young person, singles out and decides to speak to you. I want to say, be assured that listening is enough. You've been chosen. You have been chosen as that person, and they've singled you out for a reason. So active listening, what is it? We talk about it being, you being present. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means. What does being present when you're actively listening mean? And be prepared. I've said act out a scenario, and you'll be able to hopefully have these slides afterwards as well. And be kind to yourself. You don't have to have all the answers. Many of us are rescuers. Many of us want to fix things, but this isn't about fixing. This is about being part of a bigger process because somebody has spoken to you and you're going to get them the help that they need. So, what makes a good listener? So, being fully present in the conversation. And what does that mean? So, showing interest, practice eye contact. It might be that you take your glasses off because you've been reading, or you've got books in front. Get rid of it and be there with that student. And that's not always easy when you're running to a lesson, or the bell's just gone, or 15 people have said to you that day, can I have a word? Have you got a minute? We know what the pressures in schools are like. We know what the firefighting is like. But it might just be that one of the times that one young person picks you out, that they've got something to say to you, and it's about that interaction and how important that is, and not being dismissive. So yeah, look out, notice, look out for non-verbal cues. There was already a huge cue that was mentioned earlier by Anne around being able to see somebody's visible bandages. Use that, check things out. You can just use that as an opening, really. And some young people will intentionally show you something because they want some help. Ask open-ended questions to encourage further responses, and we're going to play around with that in a minute. Reflect back, paraphrase, check out what's being said. Listen to understand rather than to respond. Your job is to listen, connect, and develop that trust, really. You can summarise, try to use a non-judgmental approach. I'm going to show you a tiny little video where a lot of us sit from a place of judgment. You hear time and time again that a young person might be attention-seeking. Yes, they're seeking your attention. They're seeking help. So try sit from a place of non-judgment. And as I've said, don't attempt to fix things. It's part of a natural way of wanting to help young people, and as teachers, as learning, as teaching assistants, as pastoral workers, we want to try and fix things, and really it's just about listening. Okay, so here's our first scenario. So A 14-year-old student has approached you in the corridor and wants to tell you something. They're agitated, but they clam up a bit when you check out, when you check in on them. You haven't really got time, but you think the best approach might be to cheer them up. As Anne mentioned earlier, I think that came up, and reassure them that they are okay. So you're unvalidating their experience. You can see their distress, but you're really busy, you're running late, and you're a bit dismissive. In fact, you shut the conversation down. You all right?
Not really.
Oh, well, put a smile on your face. The weather's good. At least it's not raining today. You've got loads to look forward to. You've got a trip next week, haven't you? Yeah?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Well, that's all right then. Cheer up. Did you want to tell me something?
It doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's been really good talking to you, though. I've got a dash. So, really, in that situation, you're shutting the conversation down. You're at least this, at least that. Try to avoid those terms completely. I'm going to show you a video as to why you should avoid saying at least. So we're talking about empathy.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, and climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I always use that video in so many sort of training scenarios, because I just think it really highlights the importance of that connection and the importance of not being dismissive, and again, not trying to fix things with silver lining. I mean, Brené Brown says that's so brilliantly. Watch that video again. You'll pick up different points in the video, I think, second or third time you watch it. And it really is around just thinking about connectivity. And if somebody, back to where we started, has chosen to speak to you, it's about that connection. We're going to give the scenario a different go again now. I'll move away from the script, so we'll see how we get on. Okay, so we're down a corridor. I am in a rush to get to a lesson, and it would be okay, actually, if I hadn't got time and I said, you know, I haven't got time now, but I have at 3:10. Would you come back at that time? Because I can give you my attention then. And it would be okay to say that, because not always can we just stop on that spot then and there, especially if we've had 20 children that have said, can I have a word, can I have a word, can I have a word? So I do understand the tensions, you know, in school life, but you've got, it's about creating that safe space, really. Okay, let's try again. You're looking really worried. Are you okay?
Not really.
Not really. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by not really?
I've sort of had enough.
You've had enough. What does had enough mean?
I've had enough of being alive, really.
You've had enough of being alive. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
So recently I've been having some really dark thoughts.
Okay, some really dark thoughts. Just before we go on, you know, any conversation we have, you know that we will have to speak to somebody else. I can't keep anything to myself. If there's any sort of risk of harm, you know, to yourself or others, but, you know, do you understand that?
So you'll need to tell my parents?
Well, yeah, we'll tell somebody at school to begin with. We can do that together. But you've told me, so there must be a reason why you've told me. It might be because you want to get some help.
Yeah, I want to talk to you.
Okay, and we can talk. And we can talk now, or we can talk a little bit later. But we can do that, and we'll get the help we need. So that sort of conversation is not closing somebody down, is being present, being with them, not asking too many probing questions. It's really hard with a safeguarding hat not to go straight in there and talk about really serious, you know, are you going to harm yourself? Are you going to, what plans have you got? But that isn't part of this conversation. This is that initial conversation when somebody has approached you, and you're going to work together and get that support and just not shut somebody down. And that's really, really important. So again, not having all the answers, but checking out things. The student is worried that their parents are going to find out about what happens next, but always use that skill that you've had the courage to tell me, and that wasn't so bad, was it? And talk about whether it was bad or not, and that's the first step, really, to getting help. So yeah, it's not rocket science. It's just being present and just being there. How did that feel compared to the first time?
I felt a lot more engaging. I felt like you were actually listening to me.
Yeah.
Whereas the first time I felt like I was more of a bother.
Yeah, you felt like a bother. Yeah, so that's going to shut the conversation down completely, and then you might go home, and then you might not speak to anybody again for a number of weeks, if at all. Yeah, okay. And there can be the conversations of being shut down can be a lot worse than that was, I'm sure. Okay, so just moving on then that was the script. Okay, so. Just sort of to summarise, really, and it really is really what you've just said about, you know, being heard, being listened to. We didn't ask any particularly difficult questions. It's just about being listened to what was being said. You have to make it clear that you're going to pass this information on. You're not rescuing as that adult, as that trusted adult, or you're not silver lining. I love that that verb of silver lining that Brené Brown introduces. And you feel validated. I'm guessing that was an important part of passing that information on. We could have gone further with that conversation around what the thoughts have turned into, what actions have happened, but we chose to stop it there. But there's always more to say, more dialogue to have. Okay, and it's about keeping calm throughout, and we get the later detail later. So that, very briefly, is a little insight into being an active listener. We're not asking people to be counsellors or psychotherapists and having or any other sort of mental health intervention. It's just being there in your role as school leaders, teachers, pastoral workers, pastoral care perhaps. So good luck with all that you're doing. And my message to you is don't be scared, be compassionate. You don't need to fix anything, and you've been chosen for a reason. Thank you.
Diolch Joe am y
Thanks, Joe, for that valuable advice, and to Alice for helping her too.
Felly, pa
So,
adnoddau sydd ar
what
gael o
resources
fewn
are
gwasanaeth
available
iechyd
within the
cyfan Cymru?
NHS here in Wales?
Siaradwr ola
Our
heddiw
final
ydi
speaker today is Claire Cotter.
Arweinydd
She's the
Cenedlaethol,
National Programme Lead for Suicide and Self-Harm Prevention with the NHS Executive Wales. She's going to give us a brief look to the future on services and support due to become available in Wales. Claire.
Thank you, Bethan. So I'm Claire Cotter. I'm the National Programme Lead for Suicide and Self-Harm Prevention. That is a Welsh Government-funded programme based in the NHS Wales Executive. So I'm here to sort of look at where there might be support in the system. So after today, after this morning, from the very insightful and informative sessions that we've had this morning, for you to reflect on that probably, I'm sure over the weekend and beyond, and so I'm here to sort of map out for you where you might be able to get support going forward, and what resources are out there for you. So a quick reminder of the national strategy, the draft strategy that's out for consultation that Lynn Eagle mentioned at the start. I would encourage you to look at that. It's not a heavy document, it's an accessible document, so it's something that you could visit, I think, quite comfortably, and the deadline for the consultation feedback is the 11th of June. But it would be an interesting read in terms of the direction of travel here in Wales. In terms of resources for prevention, as I say, we are a national programme team based in the NHS Wales Executive. On the slides there, there's lots of names there, but just to say that there are 3 regional leads in the team that Anne referred to earlier. We also have a particular or a specific project manager for children and young people called Hannah Wendon. She unfortunately sadly couldn't be available today, but she's certainly there to be contacted if you wanted to contact someone to look at how you want to address these issues in schools. Since we've been here as a national resource, we have developed a digital hub. This has essentially been focused on learning and development opportunities. It's quite easy to access. If you just Google sshp.wales or .cymru, you should be able to access that, and that will provide you with access to free online resources, which are videos and other offers, very often free. But there's also a whole raft of offers from training providers across Wales that you can search for through a set of filters. There's also learning resources and information and references to the evidence base as well on that. So please feel free to visit that and to contact us if you'd like it to do things that it currently may not be doing, but it's certainly a resource that we're developing. There's been reference today, and I know a lot of the focus today has been around the national guidance that was published in 2019, responding to issues of self-harm and thoughts of suicide in young people. We are looking to see if, working again with the Education Department, looking at different ways in which we can make that resource available online, and our digital platform is one place where we can maybe develop some of the components of that guidance so that it's very accessible to you and something that you can access really quickly when you feel you need it. Both Neil and Anne have looked at or made reference to the impact of suicide once someone has died by suicide, or postvention, which is the word that we often use around that. Neil mentioned the Samaritan Step-by-Step programme. We have done quite a lot of work around this, particularly in terms of following work that we did, insights work that we did with adults in particular. But we do have an online resource called Helpers at Hand, which again is quite accessible. We know that the larger proportion of the suicides within our community are amongst people between 35 and 50. You know, a lot of those people will be parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. So the burden of bereavement in relation to suicide is quite often significant for children and young people. So even if there's not been a suicide within the school community itself, there may be children within the school who are processing grief in relation to a bereavement by suicide, and they're trying to process that while they're at school. So we do need to know more about how to understand the support needs of children and young people who have lost someone to suicide. We did work with the Health and Care Research Wales team, asked them to do a rapid evidence review around bereavement by suicide. This is available online. Again, you can access this through the evidence-based section of our digital hub. So all of the slides here that I'm sharing with you now that will be available to you afterwards, it's all hyperlinked, so you should be able to find all of this very quickly. But the finding of that rapid review was that there isn't a great deal of evidence around how we support children and young people, certainly in terms of bereavement services. They weren't necessarily looking at what can be provided through schools. So we are currently working with 2 agencies to look at doing some insights work with those with lived experience to inform national quality standards around how we support children bereaved by suicide. And that work will be looking at bereavement service providers, parents and carers, and children and young people themselves. So we're working primarily with the Childhood Bereavement Network and the Support After Suicide Partnership to develop those standards. We have also developed a basic suicide awareness e-module, and that is, has been designed for multiple agencies. It's universal, in fact, so it's for anybody to access to help them to understand suicide awareness. And having listened to all of the contributions today, I think that module is probably a really good revision of quite a lot of what was covered during today. There's a little bit about data and statistics, there's a little bit about bereavement, there's also a little bit about listening, those listening skills, so there's a recap around that in the module, and there's also signposting throughout to where you can get more information, sources for more information if you wanted to spend more time on it. So that's just our basic suicide awareness e-module, and again there'll be links to that for you following today so that you can, after reflection, maybe seek more help and more support and more information. So that's all I've got to say today. Those are the contact details for us as a team, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and that's the end of our presentations, and thanks to all of our speakers today. I mentioned at the beginning that you're welcome to submit questions and comments. The team here with me in Cardiff have been sifting through them. We now have about 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So if I can welcome back to the stage our panellists for today. Joining us for this session are Lynn Neagle, Cabinet Secretary for Education, Professor Anne John of Swansea University, Neil Ingham, Samaritans, Jo Holmes, British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, and Claire, we've just heard from her, Claire Cotter from the NHS Executive Wales. There we are. Everyone is joining me here.
Okay,
so the questions, I have them.
English now, so unless there's a specific Welsh question, you won't have to wear your additional headsets. So the first question is to the Cabinet Secretary. How important is this subject area for you in your new role?
Thank you. Well, I think it's absolutely critical, really. We recognise that schools have been through an incredibly difficult time with the pandemic. And I think that supporting mental health and well-being for young people and for school staff is an absolutely fundamental part of delivering a better education for them. We won't be able to deliver our reforms and improve children and young people's life chances unless they are in a good place and ready to learn. And the same goes for supporting our school staff.
Lovely. The next question is for you, Anne. Can you tell us about the importance of maintaining relationships with children who are excluded from school? You did touch on this, but it seems to be a really important area.
Yeah, I think, where we've highlighted that, we need to find ways to identify the children in need of more support, because often they're the children that aren't in school, whether that's because they're choosing not to be in school themselves or because we're excluding them. And I think, the children where you're going down that pathway to exclusion, if we reframe them as children in need of support rather than children in need of sanctions, then I think we're really thinking about trajectories for the future. So when I am looking at things we might have done differently when someone's taken their own life, be it when they're young or when they're older, these are the issues. Things like exclusion are the things that come up over and over and over again. And I think if we can reframe how we think about these young people, we can start putting those interventions in early.
Lovely. Next one for you, Jo. How can you tell if a child really needs support or if they're just attention seeking?
Oh, I love that question, and I did touch on it slightly in the presentation. I think saying a child is attention-seeking is really, really dismissive. It's really unhelpful, and it's more perhaps about the training that might be needed for school staff to look at working from a sort of more of a non-judgmental approach, which is a really difficult way of flipping things around, because people can be sort of quite dismissive about what other people might be experiencing. I think if a young child, a young person has sought out some help, they need something from you. There's an unmet need there. They might not be able to talk to somebody at home. They might not be talking to their peers, or they may have been talking to their peers and they said, go and speak to such and such, go speak to the school counsellor, go speak to the librarian. An assistant, a playground assistant, if people still have playground assistants in primary schools. My children are much older than that. So they've chosen you for a reason. Don't dismiss them. They need some help. Or everything is genuine. Feelings are genuine.
Just on that, it's like there's a slight terminology issue. And, in health services, it used to be with children, you'd say they did not attend. If you change that to they were not brought, then it changes the emphasis. And I think when we talk about something like attention seeking, there is a judgment in there. Whereas if you call it they need attention, those are the children that need attention. It reframes it.
Yeah, I think you've opened up a can of worms with this question. I think it's hard not to acknowledge that notion of attention seeking, or it links to that, people say cry for help in terms of self-harm or suicide behaviour, which is really problematic. Now, it's easy to understand why people might say that those behaviours, particularly self-harm, would be attention seeking, but it's completely unhelpful in seeking to support that individual or to understand the root causes of them. It's much more useful to simplistically think of them as articulations of pain or trauma or unmet need. And I think instinctively most parents will know that with their own children. Most parents these days will know that if their own children are attention-seeking and behaving in those ways, that there's a need to be addressed, or there's an emotion or a trauma or a pain to be addressed. But it's making sure we bring that across into the educational settings as well. Of course, many teachers are fully aware of this, but...
And there's a modelling behaviour. So when we, in the research we do with young people online, they can use that judgmental terminology themselves. This isn't, it happens in health, it happens everywhere. And I think if we reframe it about, it's a response to needing support and help and attention, then, and we're all using that same language, it's really important throughout the system because it perpetuates itself.
And this does boil down to the language that you use and finding the words, so it's quite key to the conference today.
It does, again, speak to that core issue around stigma with suicide. And there is still huge stigma in relation to suicide. So even the notion, because you will hear people say that somebody's cried for help in attempting a suicide at adult age as well. And I think that partly reflects that it's difficult for lots of people to get their heads round. It's incredibly difficult, even at adult age, for people to conceptualise how and why somebody would reach the stage where they would consider taking their own life. And so a simplistic response to that is to position it as a cry for help. But the more we can move away from that and flip the lens, if you like, and look at what that is an expression really of and what's being released in that action, the more effectively you can do things to mitigate that risk.
The next question is for you, Neil. You mentioned some of the resources available already, but do the Samaritans have a toolkit around vicarious trauma advice for school staff?
Vicarious trauma specifically? I think you'd find I think the step-by-step resources would be the place to go for that. I think if an individual needs support from vicarious trauma or direct emotional trauma that they've experienced because of engagement with pupils, you're going to laugh when I say this, but you can call the Samaritans and you can engage with the Samaritans and many others. Now, earlier on, I said 1 in 5, 1 in 6 of our calls are around suicidal crisis or severe emotional distress. Most of the calls Samaritans get are nowhere near that level of distress. We have many calls from people who are vicariously or directly traumatized by the emotional distress people they're close to are in. And we have many people who are just calling us because they're trying to work through feelings that they're struggling to understand. And they can do that entirely anonymously, non-judgmentally, without having to talk about where they work or who they work for or the context in which they've experienced that vicarious trauma. So step by step in terms of some of the resources within there, practical response in a professional context, but don't be afraid to speak to Samaritans or contact us online or one of the many other supportive organisations out there.
You wanted to come in, Jo?
Talking of supportive organisations, there's education support where any teaching staff, any school staff in Wales can approach that charity, and they can have access to online counselling provided by BACP counsellors, and that's not a plug, that's just around ensuring you've got that professional intervention. But also I think a very important issue to consider is school staff are carrying immense mental health caseloads. There's no processing. There's the designated safeguarding lead doesn't have clinical supervision, doesn't have supervision. Very rarely does anybody in schools have supervision other than the counselling, the psychotherapy staff. Sometimes there is supervision offered by the counselling staff if they've got that capacity or additional resources. But I think that's a really important consideration to think about. How do you process what you're carrying? Because you are carrying a lot of information, a lot of other people's stuff. Where does it go?
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say I think it's a really important question because we do need to recognise how difficult it is for school staff to hear some of these stories and how they will carry that. I was going to mention education support, but also to say that school staff can access the school's counsellors as well as the other resources such as Samaritans. We've got 111 Press 2 for mental health in Wales. We've got Call Helpline in Wales. So it's just to say that there are resources out there. But I think the question is really important because it recognises that you can't listen to those kind of conversations without needing to look after yourself as well.
Yes. Claire, you wanted to come in?
I was just going to add that we've recently gone out to commission on a national advisory and liaison service to support postvention, and that includes people who are impacted in the course of their work. So that's particularly in the event that there may have been a suicide, particularly, but that is another service that is coming online that again might be able to provide some support within a number of offers of support. I imagine they'll be a suite of things that need to be accessed.
Okay.
I guess don't underestimate your friends and colleagues. You know, the vast majority of people, that's, across health and education, that's where they get their support. So there's that upskilling within that network, I think, as well.
We appreciate the fact that the Cabinet Secretary has been with us all morning, and the last question from the list that I have here is to you. Has the Welsh Government considered arranging and funding training for school staff to attend in order to support and respond to young people who require additional mental and emotional health support? School funding is being reduced, and so schools are struggling to fund training and release staff to attend training.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's another really important question, and Welsh Government already provides 13.6 million for our whole school approach for mental health, and I'm really pleased that we've protected that funding, and we've also protected the funding for the school's in-reach service, which means that all schools have got access to CAMHS practitioners who can help with training and consultancy. But I do recognise there's more that we should be doing, and today is about that, isn't it? It's about looking at that issue, providing that support for schools. And we are looking in Welsh Government at what more we can do to provide consistent professional learning support for staff in schools. And, you know, I'll have more to say about that in due course, but absolutely recognise that's really important that we, you know, ensure schools are supported in having these difficult conversations, and I think we've made a good start in that today.
Lovely. Great. Diolch yn fawr iawn. And there's one more question, and it's for me. Will the broadcast be available to watch after today? Is it being recorded? Because they're asking for a member of staff who could not attend. And the answer is yes. All the resources and the broadcast will be available on the event platform following the session. So if you've missed anything, you can pick up on that later. Ond diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am y cwestiynau.
Thank you very much to you all for the questions and all the panellists for answering them. There's one final question for you to answer on the poll. Was the training today beneficial to you in supporting you to take part in early conversations with children and young people? If you could vote on that. And that's the end of the conference. Do remember about the support resources available if this session has affected you. There are support staff available now for about an hour after we have finished. Do get in touch confidentially through chat and someone will get back to you. And remember too about the consultation that we referred to that is live at the moment for a new strategy for Wales on suicide and self-harm. And do please read that consultation document and fill out the questionnaire. It gives an opportunity for everyone to now influence this area over the next decade. There are easy read versions and versions for children and young people available too. And there are materials for you to be able to run workshops should you wish. That's it then for today. Thanks very much to you all for joining us. Thanks to our speakers who've been contributing to this important event. Thanks to the team who have organised it, and also the crew of people behind the scenes in Cardiff and to Garmon for translating. Thanks for joining us and goodbye.